Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another season of the Inside Social Work podcast. This is the first episode for the year. I'm been really grateful to all the listeners so far. We've had over 20,000 downloads of the podcast, which is incredible. People are joining the Facebook group and being a part of the Inside Social Work community and sending me ideas of things they want to hear in upcoming episodes. And so big shout out to all those social workers out there and the listeners to the podcast. I wanted to start the podcast today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. The podcast is being recorded in the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I had a lot of fun interviewing today's podcast episode with Associate Professor Dr. Craig Hassed, and we talked about mindfulness, and I thought this was a really perfect episode to start the season, thinking about how we can be more mindful day to day and how we can support the mindfulness, being our clients and service users being more mindful in our interactions with them, and how that can really support compassion. Craig also shares some feedback, I guess, from research, looking at how mindfulness can help with things like anxiety, chronic pain and depression. And he shares some resources at the end of areas that you can explore your own mindfulness practice, some courses and training that you can do, and a new book that he's releasing. I think it's a second edition to an existing book. And I'll just check what it's called. It's Mindfulness for Life, and his new 2021 edition will be released, I think, in around June. So if you're listening to this podcast and it's before the 21st of March 2021, you can also hop onto the FutureLearn website, and there'll be a link in the podcast notes, and join the current intake of mindfulness training. It's run a few times a year, so don't fret if you feel like you've missed out. I really hope you enjoy my interview with Craig. So welcome to the podcast, Craig. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of a background into who you are and what you're doing?
Yes, Marie. It's good to be with you and all your listeners. I'm medically trained, but I had a long personal and professional interest in mindfulness. And I thought that this is a really useful skill for doctors on mental health and wellbeing, but also to help their patients. And so I got involved with medical education back in the late 80s at Monash University. And so I've been working at Monash ever since then. And now, not just in the medical course, but in a whole lot of other health disciplines. So pretty much all of the allied health programs also have mindfulness as a part of the curriculum now, not as an elective, as part of the curriculum. So that's a big passion in my working life. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing.
Yeah, wonderful. Can you tell the listeners a bit about what is mindfulness and how that might be different to the way it's kind of thrown around in the vernacular at the moment?
Well, many people have a kind of an instant notion of mindfulness being like a meditation practice, and it is. But it's not just meditation, it's also a way of living. So mindfulness, we're really cultivating an ability to be present, to be attentive, but the attitude with which we're being present and attentive. So a kind of an openness, a curiosity, a gentleness of attitude, a sort of self-compassion. So we're training attention and attitude with mindfulness practice, but not just when we're sitting in a chair meditating for 5 or 10 minutes, but to take that out into the rest of our day when the rubber is hitting the road, when everything's hitting the fan. So to actually be able to bring that mindful attentiveness and attitude even into the more challenging moments of day-to-day life and work.
Wow. You've mentioned, in your bios, and some of the work you've done is in research and publishing. How does that work in a research capacity? Like, how do we research or measure being mindful and show the impact of that?
Well, it depends on, there are lots of questionnaires that kind of try and measure a person's trait mindfulness. That means how mindful they tend to be in day-to-day life. So you ask people, do you tend to be present? Do you tend to be open to, events as they unfold? And do you tend to adopt an accepting attitude to things, even the things that find uncomfortable? So you can try and get an assessment of that. So you can measure if a person does mindfulness training, do they become more mindful over time? There's all sorts of other things you can do as well. So researching what happens in the brain when a person's mindful, or what happens to their mental health if they learn mindfulness. So probably the area of research that created most interest initially was when these kinds of practices were brought to bear for people who'd had recurrent depression. And they found if people learn mindfulness, they were much, much less likely to relapse into depression in the future compared to if they didn't have mindfulness training or just had the usual medical care by itself, that is antidepressants. And so when those kinds of studies came out, people got really interested. And so there's many, many different kinds of research that are done on mindfulness now.
Yeah. Are all mindfulness practices created equal? Like, is there variability in their effectiveness for things, like you said, to improve relapse for depression and other mental health issues?
Well, I suppose the cornerstone mindfulness meditation practices, awareness of the body, of the breathing, etc., are reasonably similar. How long a person practices for, so if a person practices for longer, they'll probably become more mindful. Like if you do more exercise, you'll get fitter. You do a little bit, you'll get fitter, but if you do more, you'll get more fit. But it's also, how do you help a person to be mindful in their day-to-day life as well? And so for clinical situations like major recurrent depression or severe chronic pain or other significant, coping with life-threatening illness like cancer and so on, the programs tend to be more intensive. So, and probably the gold standard programs would be MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. But not everybody's up for an 8-week, 2.5-hour-a-week program. And indeed, people can get quite a lot of benefit from briefer mindfulness interventions and brief mindfulness practices. So there are many different formulations, and we don't know, there's more research to do to tell which one's the best, but any amount of a practice that a person does will be a step in the right direction, though.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I've participated in a workplace, actually had that as one of their activities to reduce staff burnout. So offered that to staff for 6 weeks, which was incredible. You mentioned chronic pain or sort of pain management. How does mindfulness help with pain management?
Because you would sort of think that if you're practicing being present, then the last thing you want to do is to be present when you've got pain.
Yes, that would be the assumption.
Yeah. So now if you're starting to practice mindfulness, and let's say if a person's got chronic pain and the medical treatments are not taking it away and a person's trying to deal with it, then when a person starts to practice mindfulness, like a half-hour practice of mindfulness meditation, for example, they become very aware of what's going on in their body. So the sensations become more obvious to them. But also, if a person really pays attention, they'll notice that there's another layer of experience as well. And that is that there's a sensation experienced, but there's a mental and emotional attitude to that sensation, of hating it, of criticizing it, of wanting it not to be there. And now, if a person gets curious in a mindful way, then it's interesting to notice that that attitude actually amplifies the intrusiveness of that pain. It amplifies the suffering associated with that sensation. So, and it fixates the attention on the very thing the person's trying to get rid of. So when a person's learning mindfulness with severe chronic pain, and it takes patience and quite a lot of courage to do that, but if they're well guided by an experienced teacher in mindfulness, then the person will start to notice, yes, there's that sensation there, but adopts a more and more neutral, non-reactive attitude to it. So the person is able to notice the sensation, but as they notice it in a more accepting, open kind of way, they also notice that they don't have to have their attention monopolized by that sensation. They can bring the attention back to the breath. Or in their day-to-day life, they can bring their attention back to who they're with or what they're doing, the car they're driving, the food that they're eating. So in a sense, the sensation starts to recede into the background, not because the person's trying to block it out, but just because the person's attention's more engaged with other things. And the reduced emotional reactivity to it means that the person doesn't become hypervigilant for it and activate the stress centers when that sensation's there. So paradoxically, over time, if a person's consistent, then the amount of suffering associated with the pain diminishes significantly. And it works different to a placebo. When studies have looked at brain scans of people who learn mindfulness for pain compared to taking a placebo, they're very different pathways, and the mindfulness is much more effective.
Wow. So
if you want to sort of do a little practical experiment now, do you want to do a little experiment?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask for something similar, so go for it. Yeah.
Okay, well, for yourself and for your listeners as well, just to remain quiet, and I'd like you to notice your environment and if there is any persistent kind of sound in your environment. So it might be road noise, or it might be a refrigerator humming away, or it might be the air conditioning going or something else. But just notice some reasonably persistent noise, even if it's quiet, in the background. Now what I'd like you to do is to block out that sound in the background so that you can't hear it. Make that sound completely go away so that you don't even notice it in the slightest. If you can still hear that sound in the background, I'd like you to try even harder to block it out, like completely make it go away. Good. Okay. What did you notice, Marie?
It got louder.
It got louder. So the harder you try to block that sound out, the louder it got.
It's funny you chose that as an example because I've been doing a weekly meditation group as a participant, and we had last week, they were renovating the building next door, and the instructor was like really cautious not to say just ignore the sounds, because then that's all you could focus on. And we discussed it after about that almost exact example, that if she said don't focus on the noise, we were going to focus on it. So instead it was focusing on body sensations and bringing our awareness back to the breath and grounding, and those noises weren't as intrusive.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's a quite an interesting thing. So rather than trying to block out the very thing the person's trying to block out, it's just like, if it's there, it's there. You see, because that sound wouldn't have been intrusive before.
No, I could barely hear it until you said think about the sound.
That's right. And of course, as soon as we try to block something out, we become hypervigilant for the very thing we're trying to block out. It's not just with suffering on a physical level like pain, but also on a mental and emotional level, anxiety or depression. So a person's trying to block out the sounds and the thoughts and the feelings that they're hating themselves for having.
Yeah.
And of course, they become more and more intrusive. They dominate the attention. And that's not mindfulness. And many people, when they learn mindfulness, they say, oh, I'm no good at it, or I can't do it, or, it doesn't work for me, because they've got an assumption that it's about trying to block stuff out. And it's not. If it's there, it's there. But we can learn to be gentle with it, and we can learn to be interested in it or not interested in it.
Yeah.
And if you get more interested in something else, like your life, then the other thing recedes into the background. And the brain changes how it sort of calibrates things significantly. So it's very interesting. And the same with tinnitus. A lot of people have tinnitus, and they're trying to block it out. Is it there? Is it there? Yeah, I can still hear it. And of course, the only thing that works for tinnitus are really the principles of mindfulness. That is, it's there, okay. Just give your attention to something else. Just be interested in something else.
Yeah.
It's not about trying to block it out.
Yeah. So there's a big overlap between sort of mindfulness and, we had Louise Hayes talk about acceptance and commitment therapy and how being mindful and creating that curiosity in a way challenges the thoughts we have about our thoughts by not being hooked into them. Do you know much about those two kind of modalities, how they sit together?
Oh, look, very, very complementary. In ACT, there's a little bit less emphasis on the sitting meditation practice, but the principles of ACT are very, very much based on mindfulness principles, as with other forms of therapy that have been found to be very useful in other settings, like dialectic behavior therapy, for example. Yeah. So these kinds of principles, and these are not new ideas. The principles and practices that we associate with mindfulness these days go back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So, a few pretty cluey people quite some time ago noticed the very things that we're noticing now and have recommended these kinds of practices for a long, long time.
Mm. So for people listening who might want to incorporate some more mindfulness activities in their work, whether they work in residential care or case management, how can they start? Because I think some people get discouraged that it's a really big chunk of work that they have to do. How can they, is there any training they can do, or just sort of things they can learn on their own where they can introduce some of this language and some of these approaches with their clients and service users?
Yeah, well, I'll just say at the outset that if a person's going to use mindfulness, like MBCT or just mindfulness approaches for people who've got major recurrent depression or other significant mental health or physical health problems, then you really want to be very experienced with mindfulness. You don't want to do a 1-hour workshop and say, all right, I'm going to start helping people with depression with mindfulness, because if we don't really understand it well, we might teach what we think is mindfulness, but it could be the opposite of that.
Yeah.
So you need to get some good amount of training to be using it for serious clinical problems. But having said that, there are lots and lots of ways that a person, that a therapist, that a health professional can bring mindfulness into their work. The first way is to practice it in your own life. Practice being mindful so that we can cope with our own workload and stress and everything else. But the second thing is to bring it into the consulting room. So when a client's speaking, to really be giving you full and undivided attention, to really be present with them. It was interesting. I was running a program for psychologists a while back, and we had a half-day workshop, and then a few weeks later we had a follow-up workshop, and this was just really to help the psychologists to be more mindful in their own life. And one of the psychologists, when we're having the debrief a few weeks later, said, I've noticed some really interesting things I'd never noticed before. And she said, one of the things I've noticed is that I hardly ever listen to the answers to the questions I ask, which she was quite surprised about that. But she noticed what happened was she'd ask a question, and then while the client was responding to the question, she was actually mentally rehearsing the next 2 or 3 questions she was going to be asking. She was having a little conversation with herself. She wasn't actually listening to the words that the person was saying. She was kind of roughly aware that they were talking, but she realized that she was actually having a dialogue with herself. And she wondered, that was probably a big part of why at the end of the day she was so mentally fatigued and how it was really hard work. And she said, now I'm practicing mindfulness. So when I ask a question, I just mentally shut up and I just listen to what the client says. And she said, it's interesting because I don't have to be 2 or 3 questions ahead. I just have to be in step with the client, because the next question asks itself directly from what they've just said. And she said it's a lot more mentally restful, and we actually get to the point quicker now with much less effort. So that's perhaps an example of a health professional being mindful with somebody by really attending, really being present. And that includes being accepting, being open, being curious as things unfold. For example, we might notice that we're so keen to sort out somebody's problems, and if it's not happening, we're getting stressed ourselves. Whereas if we can just be accepting that, okay, it's going to go through some ups and downs, the process, the therapeutic process, we won't be able to help everybody or not everybody as much as we'd like to. So that kind of accepting attitude for ourselves as a practitioner can help us in not getting so stressed or taking on a lot of the vicarious stress of other people. To cultivate the kind of compassion and presence to people is a big part of being mindful. So that's the next step, is to bring it into the consulting room, to be a mindful practitioner. And then, of course, if we want to take it the next step, then we can start to just in a very, I don't know, not like trying to run full-on MBCT training or anything, but when we might be, say, with a client and they're going back and ruminating constantly over things in the past, and we can get curious and mindful, and we can just ask some questions. So this habit of ruminating about the past, is that something that you're aware that you're doing, or do you just sort of do it unconsciously and habitually? I pretty much just do it unconsciously all the time. And what effect does it have when you do that? Well, it makes me feel down and terrible about my life as it is now, etc. Okay, so, and when you notice those kinds of thoughts, what attitude do you have to? I hate myself for thinking that. I just get irritated with myself. Okay, so would you like to develop some ways of helping you to notice when you're switching into that mode of mind? Would you like to develop some ways of helping you to come back to the present moment and not to be so judgmental and critical of yourself? And, would that be of use to you? So you can ask questions in such a way that a person might see that, maybe cultivating some of these kinds of practices could be useful. And so in all sorts of ways, being more present and so on, you can actually start to offer that to somebody to help them with their life, to help them to be more mindful. If it's a major therapeutic issue, then unless you've got really good training, probably good to refer to a psychologist or other mental health professional who does have that training.
Yeah. Is it okay for people to, I've realized in my own practice, I introduce more of it as I become a more skilled practitioner myself. So it might start off with something as simple as, I tend to use, less so in COVID, but, clients will have like a cup of tea or hot chocolate, and it might just be, just take a moment, see if you can smell it. Can you hear any noises? What are 5 things you can hear? And we just do a little bit of grounding, and I build up their, I guess, tolerance, for lack of a better word, or a familiarity with being mindful through those small things. Sometimes I use like bubble mixture to get them to learn how to blow their breath with bubbles until that becomes embodied. Is that sort of stuff a good way to start introducing it into your work?
Oh, look, I think there's an infinite number of very creative ways to bring mindfulness into the work. And you see, if we start to practice mindfulness in our own lives, so when I was a junior doctor, for example, I didn't have any training in this at the time. But, when, I had very, very long shifts in hospital, I realized that when you're going all day and all night and all day and all night and into the next day, you need to conserve every molecule of energy. So just dealing with one complex clinical situation, and then you've got a call to a ward to deal with another one, and it's 3 a.m. and you're going through your second night without sleep, and you haven't had a break in about 50 hours by now, and just realizing that when walking from one ward to another, just walk, just feel the body moving, the rhythm of the body. Just notice anybody as you pass down the corridor, just notice them and acknowledge them, just to feel the rhythm of the body. And just walking mindfully was enough to give me some mental rest for that 2 minutes, rather than fill that 2 minutes with, I got so much to do, and why am I even doing this career, and when's it going to be over? So the day was full of lots of moments of mental rest. And so when between seeing one client and another, for example, just have a few mindful moments, so that when the new client steps into the room, we're more mindful with them, that we can just, when we're eating our lunch, just eat the lunch, just taste the food. So when we do that, we can then understand it from the inside out and help our clients to actually bring this into their lives in all sorts of ways, to really come to our senses, because the body's always in the present moment. That's one of the good things about the body. Like, you never get to work in the morning, I haven't got my body with me, I'm going to have to go home and get it. It's like the body is always here now, but the mind is often not. So to help the mind to be in the here and the now, we give, the body will bring the mind back into the here and the now using any of the senses, like the sense of touch, the smell, the taste, any sense, the hearing, will bring the attention back to the present moment. So there are lots of creative ways of doing that, kinds of exercises you were mentioning before, but it's literally what's meant by the term come to your senses.
You mentioned, so we've kind of talked about the benefit for clients and reoccurring sort of ruminating thoughts and chronic pain. You touched a little bit about vicarious trauma. Mm-hmm. How can listeners incorporate mindfulness, to kind of reduce burnout and vicarious trauma? Like, are there specific types of exercises they can do? Like, how can they cultivate a mindfulness practice to support their well-being in a workspace?
Yes, it's an important question if we're around people every day who are experiencing some pretty challenging events in their lives. When we experience a kind of empathy, and empathy is a wonderful thing, but when we're experiencing a kind of empathy where we are distressed by somebody else's distress, then their stress centers of their brain are firing off, but so are ours. And what happens is that the areas of the brain associated with compassion pretty much get offline. So the stress is overwhelming the compassion areas. And very often when we try to be helpful for somebody, when we're caught up in their distress, then the attempt to be helpful for them is generally not so much about what they need. It's more about what can I do quickly to put myself out of my distress. And so we actually become less helpful in a way. Now, this might sound, again, paradoxical, but when somebody's in distress, if we're practicing mindfulness, the first thing is just to be accepting. There's distress in the room. It's okay. And mind you, if day by day we can learn to be more comfortable in the presence of our own distress, as we were talking about it before, then it makes it easier to be more comfortable in the presence of other people's distress. And it's not about trying to wall ourselves off from it, cut off and pretend it's not there. It's not about, diving into the quicksand with somebody and getting caught up in the same problems. It's the ability to just be present, to be open, to be accepting. And if we can just cultivate that sort of sense of compassion for ourselves, of course, but compassion for that person. And there's not a quick, I've got to fix the person or fix the situation. It's just an ability to be with it. Then if there's something that might be helpful, it'll arise from a different place. The stress areas of the brain aren't overwhelming the areas of the brain that are trying to make decisions, and the compassion areas of the brain aren't swamped by. So, and compassion is not associated with this sort of vicarious stress or vicarious trauma. Compassion, when we experience that, is associated with activation of all sorts of areas of the brain associated with positive emotions. So there's a kind of an openness, there's a kind of acceptance, there's a kind of compassion that we can cultivate through mindfulness that can also help not only the client, but help ourselves as well. Because if we're not dealing well with that vicarious stress, one or two things tend to happen over time is we either wall ourselves off and become cynical and cold and removed, or we get overwhelmed by it and pretty soon find we can't go on with the job. I was running some programs once for people who are working in child protection. They said the turnover in these jobs is about somewhere around 6 to 9 months. Most people are pretty much burned out by that stage. And really, when we're moving into really complex and challenging areas, we've got to look after the health professionals as well as the patients. And we've got to learn, I think, these skills. If we don't, we're going to be in trouble sooner or later.
Yeah, that's a really nice point for practitioners to really take on. Mm. That self-compassion thing, I think, is a bit of a challenge for some. So be curious to see what comes up as people listen to this, what thoughts they have to that. Any so you've written, I'm just looking at the list of, you've written a huge collection of books and kind of co-founded the couple of programs. Are there any sort of standout things for listeners you think would be useful, who who are working in sort of the mental health or well-being kind of social work space?
Yeah, well, Mindfulness for Life, and there's a new edition of that coming out. That's a book I wrote with Exile Publishing. And so if you want an all-round book looking at mindfulness and its various uses and how to apply it personally and professionally, that would be a pretty good resource. But there's also a couple of free online mindfulness courses we developed at Monash University, but they're on the FutureLearn platform. The first course is Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance, and it goes live 3 times a year, and it's totally free, no cost to do it. And it's a 4-week course that people will do at their leisure. And then there's a follow-up course for people who'd like to do that as well, called Maintaining a Mindful Life. And again, 4 weeks, do it at your own pace over that period of time, and it goes live a few times a year as well. So that's on the FutureLearn platform. And then the best apps. And according to an independent review, Headspace, the UK Headspace, great for mental health resources and mindfulness. But a free app developed in Australia was also ranked right at the top, called Smiling Mind. And I'm an ambassador for Smiling Mind, so I don't mind promoting them. But that's a free app. So it's a philanthropic group that put that together. And they've got a wealth of fantastic resources that are age specific as well. So everything from young children through to, adults and everything in between. So there's some very good resources if people want to learn more about mindfulness.
Mm. And one thing I wanted to end with is you mentioned, you use the analogy of, well, if you exercise more, you get fitter. How do people incorporate that into their practice? Like, I think some people think I might do a half-hour class once a week. Is that enough? Is it better to do 5 minutes a day? Like, what are some of the ways to make it a part of your day-to-day routine so you get the most benefit?
From the meditation practice, sometimes called the formal practice of mindfulness, and nobody really knows yet if you do a half-hour practice or 6 5-minute practices, do you get more or less benefit? I think the regularity is pretty good. And mind you, only people who are really significantly distressed or highly motivated are ready to do a 30 or a 40-minute practice of meditation. But for the busy professional, starting off with, say, 5 minutes twice a day. So before you get into your working day, 5 minutes of mindfulness practice. And that helps you to move into the day mindfully. And then at the end of your working day, between that and whatever you're going to do in the evening, for example, 5 minutes of mindfulness as well. So you put a little bit of space between your work and the rest of your life. You could say that that's 2 full stops in your day, but I'd say lots of little commas as well. So that is between one client and another. You might just give yourself half a minute or a minute, a mini meditation practice. And so that's the formal practice. And the aim of that is to help us to be more mindful while we're going about our life. Present in a complex clinical situation, but also present when we're just having our lunch or walking through the park, or at the end of a really full-on day, you give that pillow your full and undivided attention and just to be present then as well. And so whether the moment is mundane or profoundly important, from a mindfulness perspective, it all matters just as much.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll put some links to the book and the FutureLearn stuff on the website. I think I'm a couple of weeks into one of the programs, so it might have to be a little while before people join in again if they run them as sort of structured courses. But thanks so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Marie. It's been useful for your listeners.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Craig. He's such a gem and really embodies a lot of the mindfulness practices in his interactions with me. It was such a beautiful episode to be a part of. So just a reminder, so Craig's book will be released in around June of 2021, and you can get that wherever it is you get your book. So look out for Mindfulness for Life and the FutureLearn course. So you can hop onto futurelearn.com and look for that mindfulness course. There'll also be a link in the show notes. It's so great to be back in the podcasting chair. I did feel a little rusty starting off, but we're getting back into the swing of things. We've got some really great guests and speakers in the upcoming episodes. So please get in touch if you've got something you'd like to share. If you want to inquire about being on the podcast, you can reach out to me. So my email address is marie@insidesocialwork.com. You can reach out to me through the Facebook group, through LinkedIn. You can even join the Inside Social Work Facebook group and be a part of that community. And I look forward to more episodes coming up and hearing about people's stories and what they're doing. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.